Chapter 7 of Blackbeard, Buccaneer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Carlos Recio. Titled by Ralph D. Paine. Chapter 7. The Mist of the Cherokee Swamp. The dark cloud of anxiety was lightened a trifle by the fact that Blackbeard displayed no ill temper toward the two young castaways. Having obtained such information as they chose to offer, he roughly told them to go forward and join the crew. Whether or no, Jack was impressed as a pirate, and it may have amused Blackbeard to recruit by force the nephew of the Honorable Secretary of the Provincial Council. For his part, Jack was grateful to be regarded no longer as a hostage under sentence of death. With Joe as an escort, who knew the ropes, he went on deck and was promptly kicked off the poop by the mate. They first found food and quenched their raging thirst with water, which had a loathsome smell. Joe reported to the chief gunner and begged the chance to sleep for a dozen hours on end. This was granted amiably enough, and the pirates clustered about to ask all manner of curious questions, but the weary lads dragged themselves into the bows of the ship and curled up in a stupor. There they lay as if drugged, all through the night, even when the seamen trampled over them to haul the head sails and tack ship. When at last they blinked at the morning sky, it dismayed them to find the breeze blowing strong out of the southeast and the Revenge standing into the coast under easy sail. They looked aft, and saw Blackbeard at the rail with a long glass in his eye. The whole crew was eager with expectation, and the routine work went undone. The ship had been put about several hours earlier, Joe learned, and was due soon to sight the shore unless a reckoning was all at fault. So cleverly had Blackbeard calculated the drift of the boys' raft that a little later in the morning a lookout in the maintop called down, "Land ho! 2 points off the starboard bow she bears." "The maintop, ahoy!" shouted Blackbeard. "Can you see a vessel's spars?" "'Tis too hazy on shore, but unless my eyes played me tricks, a smudge of smoke arises." Jack Cockrell nervously confided to Joe, "That'll be Captain Wellesby's campfire on the beach." "Trust him to douse it," was the easy assurance. "I feel better. Blow me, but I expect to live another day." "Answer me why," begged Jack. "I'm like a palsied old man." "Well, you know this bit of coast, how low it sets above the sea. Despite the haze, a man aloft could see a ship's masts, and yards before he had a glimpse of land." "Then the wreck of the Plymouth Adventure had slid off the shoal and gone down, Joe?" "Yes, when the wind veered and stirred a surf on the shoal, she pounded over with a flood tide and dropped into 15 fathom. "Then we are saved, for now," joyfully exclaimed Jack. "Unless we're unlucky enough to find some of those plaguey pirates afloat on a raft or making signals from the beach." The Revenge sailed shoreward until those on board could discern the marching lines of breakers which tumbled across the shoal. The smudge of smoke had vanished from the beach. The lookout man concluded that the haze had deceived him. Blackbeard steered as close as he dared go, with a sailor heaving the lead. But there was no sign of life among the sand dunes and the stunted trees. And the Plymouth Adventure had disappeared, leaving no trace excepting scattered bits of floating wreckage. The pirate ship headed to follow the coast to the northward, on the chance that Ned Rackham's prize crew might have made a landing elsewhere. To Jack Cockrell, the gift of life had been miraculously vouchsafed him, and he felt secure for the moment. Joe's theory seemed plausible, that the pirates had abandoned the Plymouth Adventure in time to avert drowning with her, and were driven away from the bight and the beach by Captain Wellesby's well-armed sailors. "Do they know Blackbeard's rendezvous in the North Carolina waters, Joe?" was a natural query. "Are they likely to make their way thither, knowing that honest men will slay them at sight?" "The swamps and the murderous Indians will take full toll of them, Jack. I believe we have seen the last of those rogues, but I'd rest better could I know for certain. Meanwhile, this mad Blackbeard may be taken in one of his savage frenzies and shoot me for sport," said young Master Cockrell, for whom existence had come to be one hazard after another. "He seems strangely tame, much like a human soul," observed Joe. "I've never beheld him like this. He plots some huge mischief, methinks." And now the ship's officers drove the men to their work, but they were less abusive than usual. They seemed to reflect Blackbeard's milder humor, and it was manifest that they wished to avoid the crew's resentment. Joe Hawkridge was puzzled, and began to ferret it out among his friends who were trustworthy. They had their own suspicions, and the general opinion was that Blackbeard was in great dread of encountering Captain Stede Bonnet in the Royal James. It seemed that the Revenge had spoken a disabled merchant ship just after the storm, and her skipper reported that he had been overhauled by Stede Bonnet a few days earlier, and the best of his cargo stolen. Blackbeard had been seized with violent rage, but had suffered the ship to proceed on her way because of his own short-handed condition. With the prize crew lost in the Plymouth Adventure, including sailing master Ned Rackham, and the 2 sloops of the squadron missing with all hands, the terrible Blackbeard was in poor shape to meet this Captain Bonnet, who hated him beyond measure. As if this were not gloomy enough, there were men of the Revenge eager to sail under Bonnet's flag and to mutiny if ever they sighted the Royal James. It behooved Blackbeard to press on to that lonely inlet on the North Carolina coast and avoid the open sea until he could prepare to fight this dangerous foeman. It surprised Jack Cockerell to see how quiet a pirate ship could be. The ruffians were bone-weary, for one thing, after the struggle to bring the vessel through the storm, and the scourge of tropic fever had left its marks. Moreover, the rum was running short because some of the casks had been staved in the heavy weather, and Blackbeard was doling it out as grog with an ample dilution of water. There was no more dicing and brawling in tipsy choruses. Sobered against their will, some of these bloody-minded sinners talked repentance or shed tears over wives and children deserted in distant ports. The wind blew fair until the Revenge approached the landmarks familiar to Blackbeard and found a channel which led to the wide mouth of Cherokee Inlet. It was a quiet roadstead sheltered from seaward by several small islands. The unpeopled swamp and forest fringed the shores, but a green meadow and a margin of white sand offered a favorable place for landing. As the Revenge slowly rounded the last wooded point, the tall mast of a sloop became visible. The pirates cheered and discharged their muskets in salute as they recognized one of the consorts which had been blown away in the storm. Blackbeard strutted on his quarter-deck, no longer biting his nails in fretful anxiety. He had donned the military coat with the glittering buttons and epaulets and the huge cocked hat with a feather in it. He noted that the sloop, which was called the Triumph, fairly buzzed with men, many more than her usual complement. No sooner had the ship let her anchor splash than a boat was sent over to her with the captain of the sloop, who made haste to pay his compliments and explain his voyage. He was a portly, sallow man with a blustering manner, and looked more like a bailiff or a tapster than a brine-pickled gentleman of fortune. Blackbeard hailed him cordially and invited him into the cabin. The boat waited alongside the Revenge, and the men scrambled aboard to swap yarns with the ship's crew. Jack Cockerell hovered near the group as they squatted on their heels around a tub of grog and learned that the Triumph had rescued the crew of the other sloop just before it had foundered. There were 100 men of them in all, crowded together like dried herring, and part were sleeping ashore in huts of boughs and canvas. No wonder Blackbeard was in blither spirits. Here was a company to pick and choose from, and so fill the depleted berth deck of the Revenge. Finding the poop deserted, Joe Hawkridge ventured far enough to peer in at a cabin window. Blackbeard was at table, together with his first mate, the chief gunner, the acting sailing master, and the captain of the sloop. They were exceeding noisy, singing most discordantly, and laughing at indecent jests. Suddenly Blackbeard whipped 2 pistols from his sash and fired them under the table, quite at random. The first mate leaped up with a horrible yell and clapped a hand to the calf of his leg. Then he bolted out of the cabin, which was blue with smoke, and limped in search of the surgeon. Joe Hawkridge dodged aside, but he heard the jovial Blackbeard shout with a whoop of laughter. "Discipline, damme! If I don't kill one of you now and then, you'll forget who I am." Inasmuch as none of the other guests dared squeak after this episode, it was to be inferred that they were properly impressed. In a little while, the mate returned with his leg neatly bandaged, announced that it was a mere flesh wound, and sat down as though nothing out of the ordinary had occurred to mar the festive occasion. Through the rest of the day, boats were passing between the ship and the sloop in a convivial reunion. Supper was to be cooked on the beach in great iron kettles, and a frolic would follow the feast. The sloop had rum enough to sluice all the parched gullet aboard the Revenge. Jack Cockerell had no desire to join the stupid revel, but he was eager to get ashore to discover what opportunity there might be to escape. But the wiser Joe Hawkridge counseled patience, saying, "Wait a bit. We'd be as helpless as any babes, should we take to our heels in this ungodly wilderness. Is there a town or plantation nearby?" "I know not," ruefully confessed Jack. "Charlestown lies to the south, and Virginia to the north. There my knowledge fetches up short." "And leagues of morass to flounder through, by the look of this coast," said Joe. "We be without weapons, or food, or—" "I'm a hot-headed fool, I grant you that," broke in Jack. "Now bestow your sage advice." "You will not be allowed to go ashore for one thing, Master Cockerell. Blackbeard has no notion of letting you get away from him to betray his rendezvous and stir the colonies to send an expedition after him." "Steady the helm, Jack, and watch for squalls. If I can read the signs, there is trouble afoot, and we must seek our own advantage in the nick of time." "But these wild sots no longer think of mutiny and the like, Joe. They are content to let the morrow go hang." "Shh! We're the master of the sloop," cautioned Joe. "He makes for the gangway, the big lump of tallow." They moved away while Captain Richard Spender clumsily descended into his boat, his broad face flushed, his breath asthmatic. He had a piping voice, absurd for his bulk, and the two lads amused themselves with mimicking him as the boat pulled in the direction of the sloop. So safe against surprise did Blackbeard regard himself in this lonely anchorage that no more than a dozen men were left aboard to keep the ship through the night. Among these was Jack Cockerell, as his comrade had foreseen. It therefore happened that they remained together, for Joe had volunteered to join the anchor watch. In a melancholy mood, the two lads idled upon the after deck. The sun dropped behind the dark, entangled forest, and flights of herons came winging it home to the islets in the swamps. On the sword by the silver strand, the throng of pirates had stilled their clamor, while a rascal with a tenor voice held them enraptured with the haunting refrain of "Sweet Annie Frey, the sea beach came, where jockeys climbed the vessel's side. Ah, what can keep her heart at hame, when jockeys tossed aboon the tide? Far off till distant realms he gangs, but ice be true as he had been, and when ilk lass around him thrangs, he'll think of Annie's faithful een." Forlorn Jack Cockerell had homesick thoughts, and felt hopeless of losing the snares which bound him. All that sustained his courage was the sanguine deposition of Joe Hawkridge, whose youthful soul had been so battered and toughened by dangers manifold on land and sea that he expected nothing less. Listening to the pirates' moving ballad, they sat and swung their legs from the ship's taffrail, while their gaze idly roved to the green curtain of undergrowth which ran lush to the water's edge to the northward of the beach. It was Joe who called attention to a floating object which moved inside the mouth of the small, tidal creek that wandered through the marshy lowlands. In the shadowy light, it could easily be mistaken for a log drifting down on the ebb of the tide. This was what the lads assumed it to be, until they both noticed a behavior curious in a log. The long, low object turned athwart the current at the entrance of the creek and shot toward the nearest bank as though strongly propelled. Joe lifted the telescope from its case in front of the wooden binocle box and squinted long at the edge of the creek. Crude though the glass was, he was enabled to discern that the object was in truth a log, but evidently hollowed out. Rounded at the ends, it held two men whose figures so blended into the dusk that they disclosed themselves only when in motion. "A pirogue," said Joe, "and fashioned by Indians. What is the tribe hereabouts? Have ye a guess?" "Roving Yamassees, or men of the Hatteras tribe," answered Jack. "Yonder brace of savages will be scouts." "Aye, but there'll be no attack against this pirate's bivouac right under the guns of the ships. The Indians are too wise to attempt it. Look, Joe, hand me the glass. Those two spies have quitted the pirogue. 'Tis quite empty. They may lay up all night to creep closer and keep watch on the camp." "Right enough, by Crambo, if we could but gain yon cypress canoe, and steal along the coast by sail and paddle." "'Tis the chance we prayed for," eagerly exclaimed Jack. "Dare we swim for it?" "Not without a boat just coming off from shore. What if we try it in the night and find the pirogue gone? We're stranded for sure, and Blackbeard will kill us." Baffled, they strained their eyes until the shore stood black in the starlight, but as long as the dusk lingered, they fancied they could descry the empty pirogue. The ship's boat, which presently drew alongside, contained Blackbeard himself and Captain Dick Spender of the Triumph sloop, besides several officers of the two vessels. They withdrew into the cabin, and there was prolonged discussion, lasting well toward midnight. It was a secretive session, with trusted men of the boat's crew posted to keep eavesdroppers away from the hatches and windows, nor was there any loud carousing. Some business was afoot, and Jack wondered whether it might concern the trouble which Joe had sworn was brewing under the surface. A circumstance even more suspicious was that 3 of the sailors from the boat were called into the cabin. Joe Hawkridge knew them as fellow loyal to Blackbeard, through thick and thin, drunken beasts, as rule. They were cold sober tonight. As quietly as they had come, the whole party dropped into the boat and returned either to the beach or to the sloop, which rode at anchor 2 cable lengths away. The Revenge floated with no more activity on her darkened decks. The few men of the watch drowsed at their stations or wistfully gazed at the fires ashore and the mob of pirates who moved in the red glare. Jack Cockerell and Joe Hawkridge felt no desire for sleep. As the ship swung with the turn of the tide, they went to the side and leaned on the tall bulwark where they might catch the first glimpse of the shore with the break of day. Meanwhile, they busied themselves with this wild scheme and that. Sifting them out, it was resolved to swim from the ship at the first opportunity. If they could not find the Indian pirogue, Joe would try to get into the pirates' camp by night and possess himself of an axe, an adze, a musket or two, and such food as he could smuggle out. Then, at a pinch, they could hide themselves a little way inland and hew out a pirogue of their own from a dry log. After hitting upon this plan, the better it seemed, the more they thrashed it over. Unluckily, it occurred to them so late in the night that they feared to attempt it then, lest the dawn might overtake them while they were swimming. "'Twas a great pity," said Joe, "that their wits had hung fire, like a damp flintlock, for this was the night when the pirates would be the most slack and befuddled, and it would be precious hard wading through another day." Jack glumly agreed with this point of view. It was so near morning, however, that they lingered to scan the shore. Then it was observed that a pearly mist was rising from the swamplands and spreading out over the water. It was almost like a fog, which the morning breeze would dispel after a while. Rolling like smoke, it hung so low that the topmast of the sloop rose above it all through her hull, was like the grey ghost of a vessel. "No sign of wind as yet," said Joe, holding up a wetted finger, "and that red sunset bespoke a calm, hot day. This odd smother o' mist may stay a couple of hours. Will you venture it with me, Jack?" "Gladly. Over we go, before the watch is flogged awake by the boss and his mate." They crept aft to the high stern and paid out a coil of rope until it trailed in the water beneath the railed gallery which overhung the huge rudder. Joe belayed his end securely and slid over like a flash, twisting the rope around one leg and letting himself down as agile as a monkey. Without a splash, he cast himself loose, and Jack followed, but not so adroitly. When he plopped into the water, the commotion was like tossing a barrel overboard, but nobody sounded an alarm. They clung to the rusty rudder chains and listened. The ship was all quiet. Then out into the mist they launched themselves, swimming almost submerged, dreading to hear an outcry and the spatter of musket balls. But the veiling mist and the uncertain light of dawn soon protected the fugitives. It was slow, exhausting progress, hampered as they were by their breeches and shoes, which could not be discarded. They tried to keep a sense of direction, striking out for the mouth of the creek in which a pirogue had been moored, but the tide set them off the course, and the only visible marks were the spars of the ship behind them and the sloop's topmast off to one side. Jack swam more strongly and showed greater endurance because he had the beef and had been better nourished all his life than the scrawny young powder boy who was more like a lath. Now and then Jack paused to tread water while his shipmate clung to his shoulder and husbanded his waning strength with that indomitable grin on his freckled phiz. Of one thing they were thankful, that the tide was bearing them farther away from the pirates' camp, which was now as still as though the sleepers were dead men. "Blood and bones, but I have swum a league already," gurgled Joe during one of the halts. "Shut your mouth or you'll fill up to the hatch and founder," scolded Jack. "I see trees in the mist. The shore is scarce a pistol shot away." "I pray my keel scrapes soon," spluttered the waterlogged Hawkridge as he kicked himself along in a final effort. Huzzah! Their feet touched the soft ooze, and they fell over stumps and rotted trunks buried under the surface. Scratched and beplastered with mud, they crawled out in muck, which gripped them to the knees, and roosted like buzzards upon the butt of a prostrate live oak. "Marooned," quoth Joe, "to be eaten by snakes and alligators." "Nonsense," snapped Master Cockerel, who had hunted deer and wild fowl on the Carolina coast. "We can pick our way with care. I have seen pleasanter landscapes than this, but I like it better than Blackbeard's company." There was no disputing this statement, and Joe plucked up spirit, as was his habit when another arduous task confronted him. Cautiously they made their way from one quaking patch of sedge to another, or scrambled to their middles. There came a ridge of higher ground, thick with brambles and knotted vines, and they traversed this with less misery. A gleam of water among the trees, and they took it to be the creek which they sought to find. Wary of lurking Indians, they wormed along on their stomachs, and so came to the high swamp grass of the bank. They swam the creek and crept toward its mouth. Jack was rooting along like a bear when he almost bumped into the dugout canoe, which had looked so very like a stranded log. It was tied to a tree by a line of twisted fiber, and the rising tide had borne it well up into the marsh. Here, it was invisible from the ship, and only a miracle of good fortune had revealed it to the lads in that glimpse from the deck at sundown. They crawled over the gunwale and slumped in the bottom of the pirogue, which was larger than they expected, a clumsy yet seaworthy craft with a wide floor and space to crowd a dozen men. Fire had helped to hollow it from a giant of a cypress log, for the inner skin was charred black. 3 roughly made paddles were discovered. This was tremendously important, and all they lacked was a mast and sail to be true navigators. Something else they presently found, which was so unlooked for, so incredible, that they could only gape and stare at each other. Tucked in the bow was a seaman's jacket of tarred canvas, of the kind used in wet weather. So to the inside of it was a pocket of leather with a button flap. This Jack Cockrell proceeded to explore, recovering from his stupefaction, and fished out a wallet bound in sharkskin, as was the habit of sailors to make for themselves in tropic waters. It contained nothing of value, a few scraps of paper stitched together, a bit of coral, a lock of yellow hair, a Spanish coin, some shreds of dry tobacco leaf. Carefully Jack examined the ragged sheets of paper which seemed to be a carelessly jotted diary of dates and events. Upon the last leaf was scrawled, Bill Saxby, his share, and beneath this entry such items as these. April the 17th. A Spanish ship rich laden, 1 sack vanilla, 2 rolls blue cloth of Peru, 1 packet bezoar stones. May the 24th. A poor ship, 3 bars of silver, 1 case cordial waters, a golden candlestick, my share by lot of 4 ye mast. Joe Hawkridge could neither read nor write, but he had ready knowledge of the meaning of these entries, and he cried excitedly, "Say the name again, Jack. Bill Saxby, his share, strike me blind. But I was chums with Bill when we lay off Honduras. As decent a lad as ever went a piratin'. A heart of oak is Bill, hailin' from London town." "But what of the riddle?" impatiently demanded Jack. "When's this Indian pirogue? And where's Bill Saxby?" "He sailed with Stede Bonnet, bless ye," answered Joe. "These 2 men we spied in the canoe last night were no Indians. They were Captain Bonnet's men. Indians would have hit the pirogue more craftily. But they came not along the coast. Did they drop down this creek from somewhere inland?" "There you put me in stays," confessed Joe. "One thing I can swear. They were sent to look for Blackbeard's ships. And I sore mistrust they were caught whilst prowling near the camp. Else they would have come back to the canoe before day." End of chapter 7.